The gulls at the marina had a schedule, and it was earlier than anybody else's. By 6 in the morning, they had already been down the length of the floating dock twice, and by the time Isaac Renfrow came down the ramp with 2 cups of coffee, they had moved on to the yard, where a mechanic named Amos Pell was greasing the travel lift and had a reputation among the birds for dropping things. It was a Tuesday in July. The inlet was flat and the color of an old nickel. 11 boats sat back in the water where they belonged, and at the head of the ramp there was a new sign, hand-painted, with a name on it that had not been there in the spring. Ria Amato, the harbor master, was walking the dock with a clipboard and a pencil behind her ear, counting cleats she had already counted. "You are in the Whitaker boat again," she said. "I am in the Whitaker boat until the Whitaker boat stops filling with water," Isaac said, and handed her the second coffee and got down on his knees on the swim platform and put his head into a bilge that smelled the way bilges smell. "Before you go any further, keep your eye on the man with his head in that bilge and on the name painted on that new sign. By the end of this, they turn out to be the same answer, and it is not the one the club expected. Stay with it." 9 weeks earlier, the rain was coming in sideways off the water, and there was not a person in that clubhouse who could have told a stranger his last name. The middle of May had produced the kind of evening the club advertised and almost never got. 200 tickets sold, 90 people through the doors, a string trio, and salmon. Isaac had not been invited, which did not trouble him, because he had been at work since 6 that morning, and had a daughter in the yard office doing a school project about local birds. He came up to the clubhouse at 7 for one reason. A member had left a spare key for a boat being sea trialed in the morning, and the front desk was where spare keys lived. 40 seconds in and out. He was wearing what he had been wearing all day. Work trousers, a jacket that had stopped being waterproof around 2023, and boots. He got as far as the front desk. Preston Vo had been the general manager for 2 years. He was 44. He had come from a hospitality company that ran 11 properties up the coast, and he believed a room was a performance he was responsible for staging. He crossed the lobby at a pace that told everybody in it that something was being handled. "Sir," he said, "Sir, this entrance is for guests this evening. I am dropping off a key. There is a service door." Vo had a hand on Isaac's elbow by then, which is a thing that people do when they are quite sure of themselves. He steered, and Isaac went, because the alternative was to plant his feet in front of 90 members and make the whole lobby into a scene. At the door, Vo said it, and he did not lower his voice because he did not think of it as a thing that needed lowering. Guests only, not the help. Then the door, and the warm light behind it, and the rain. Junie Renfrow, 9 years old, was standing at the bottom of the ramp with her hood up, having come to find her father because she had finished the bird project. She saw the whole thing through the glass. Isaac came down the ramp and did not look back at the clubhouse, which took some doing. He crouched so he was at her altitude and asked her whether gulls counted as local birds or as a personal problem. She said both. He said that was the right answer. Then he went and tied off 2 boats that did not need tying off because his hands wanted something to do. The Renfrow house sat up above the inlet on a road that the town plowed last, and it had a kitchen window that showed about a third of the marina to anybody willing to lean. Isaac had been leaning at that window since 2014. Mornings went in a fixed order. Coffee, the weather radio, cereal for a person who had opinions about which bowl, and a school lunch assembled from things Junie approved of, which was a shorter list than her father would have liked. "Is tonight the fancy party?" she asked, on the morning of the gala. "For some people." "Are we some people?" "We are the people who make sure the fancy party has boats to look at," Isaac said. And she considered that and decided it was acceptable. She had a project due on local birds. She had drawn a cormorant with a good deal of confidence and slightly too many toes, and she had a list of birds identified personally from the end of D-Dock. The truck started on the second try, which was its custom. At the yard by 6:30, Isaac had a diesel with a fuel delivery problem that 3 people had already looked at. The boat had been through a fuel filter, a lift pump, and a set of injectors, and it still died at 1,100 revolutions like somebody was turning a tap. Amos Pell sat on a stool with a coffee and offered commentary, which was his role in the yard and had been for 40 years. "They put a new filter on it," Amos said. "They put 3 new filters on it." "Well then." Isaac took the fuel cap off and smelled it. He ran a finger inside the fill neck and looked at it. Then he siphoned a cup off the bottom of the tank into a jar and held it up to the light of the open bay door. There was a fine gray silt at the bottom of the jar, and a seam of water under the diesel like the line in a level. "Somebody topped her off at the town dock in the rain with the cap off," he said. "Tank's dirty and it's carrying water. Filters are doing their job. That's why they keep clogging. You have got to pull the tank and clean it." He said it without any particular pleasure, which was the thing about him. He had just solved in 9 minutes a problem that had cost a member $400 in parts, and he sounded like a man reading a tide table. At midday, he was on the floating dock when Rhea Amato came down it with the storm track on her tablet. She had been harbor master for 6 years. She had a way of asking questions that assumed the person she was asking knew something, which is rarer than it sounds, and which had made her, over those 6 years, the only person in that entire operation Isaac genuinely looked forward to seeing. "West," she said. "It moved west again overnight." "How far west?" "Far enough that I want to talk about the North Basin." They looked at the North Basin, which held 11 boats on floating docks with open water in front of it, and which had flooded once in 1992 and been a subject of quiet anxiety ever since. "If it comes in at the top of the tide," Isaac said. "Yes." "Then they come out." "That is what I think too," Rhea said. "I am glad we agree, because nobody upstairs is going to want to hear it on gala night." He had come to that marina in 2007 at 19 for a summer job, and he had never got around to leaving. Harold Coyle owned it then. Everybody called him Hal. He had opened the place in 1978 with a borrowed backhoe and a great deal of optimism. And by the time Isaac arrived, he was a wiry man of 60 with a bad hip who could recite the history of every hull in the yard and most of the marriages attached to them. Hal taught him engines. Then he taught him weather, which took longer. Then he taught him the part that nobody teaches, which is how to talk to a person who has just put their boat on a sandbar in front of an audience. "You do not own the water, son," Hal said once from the end of the fuel dock, watching a man back a 40-foot boat into a slip badly. "You just keep the edges tidy." Maggie Coyle came home in 2012 to help her father with the books. which had been kept for 34 years in a system only Hal understood, involving 3 ledgers and a coffee can. She was not impressed by Isaac at first. She had watched a long parade of young men fall in love with the idea of that waterfront, and she was waiting to see whether he would still be there in October. He was still there in October and the following October. They married in 2014 in the yard, between a boat on jack stands and a stack of pallets, with Hal giving the toast and going on for 11 minutes. Junie came in 2017 and was on the dock in a life jacket before she could reliably walk. In October of 2019, Maggie stood up from the kitchen table to get a dish towel and did not make it to the counter. It was an aneurysm. It took about 4 minutes, and there was nothing that anybody, including 2 paramedics who arrived very fast, could have done differently. She was 33. Junie was 2. Isaac got up the next morning and made cereal because there was a 2-year-old in the house. And that is the entire reason he got up the next morning. Hal Coyle lasted 18 months after his daughter. He died in March of 2021 in a hospital bed with a tide chart on the tray table, which everybody who knew him agreed was correct. 2 weeks after the funeral, the trust attorney, Verna Adcock, came out to the yard in a car unsuited to the yard and explained, patiently and twice, what Hal had done. The Marina did not go to Isaac. It went to Junie. All of it, the land, the docks, the yard, the buildings, the club lease, held in trust for a 4-year-old, with her father as trustee until she turned 25. It is hers, Verna said. You are only holding it. Isaac had asked one question, which she said afterward was not the question most people ask. He asked whether the trust was allowed to pay his mortgage. It was not, and he had not expected it to be, and he had asked so that he would know the shape of the fence he was standing inside. He kept working the docks. He drew the same wage he had drawn as the yard's senior mechanic, which the trust paid him because the Marina needed a senior mechanic, and he was one. And he did not tell anybody, and the reasons he gave himself were good ones for about the first year. The storm was not supposed to be anything. 4 days out, it had been a smear of green on a chart with a low probability attached, and the club had printed the gala menus and gone on with its week. 2 days out, it moved west. On the morning of the gala, it moved west again, and the surge forecast for the inlet went from a number nobody minds to a number that made Ria Amato stop what she was doing and sit down. At 3 p.m, she was in the harbor master's office with the tablet propped against a mug, doing the arithmetic that her job actually consists of. High tide at 1:40 in the morning, surge on top of it, wind out of the southeast, which is the one direction the North Basin has no answer for, because the breakwater was built in 1978 by a man with a borrowed backhoe who was worried about a different wind. 11 boats. She called the yard and got Amos, then walked up to the clubhouse in the rain because the club held the lease on the North Basin docks and somebody in a jacket had to be told. She found Vo in the service corridor with a clipboard of his own, going through a table plan. He listened to about 40 seconds of it. The forecast has been wrong twice this month, he said. It has been wrong low twice this month. We have 200 people coming through that door in 3 hours. He did not look up from the table plan, and nobody is hauling anything during my dinner. Preston Voss was not a wicked man, and the story would be smaller if it pretended otherwise. He had never stolen anything. He paid his staff on time and a photograph of his own daughter sat on his desk. What was wrong with him was simpler and more common. He had worked in the hospitality for 22 years, and somewhere in there, he had come to believe that the members were the point and the water was scenery, and that everything below the clubhouse windows was a kind of weather that happened to other people. Rhea went back down the hill in the rain. She did not go to the yard office to complain. She went there to work, which is a different thing, and she found that Isaac had already started. The travel lift was out of its shed and running. The slings were laid out. Amos had counted jack stands and come up 4 short and had already called the boatyard 2 coves over about borrowing 4. Nobody had authorized any of it. "You are staging a haul-out that has not been approved," Rhea said. "I am moving equipment around a yard I work in," Isaac said. "If it gets approved, we are an hour ahead. If it does not, I put it all back." He said it lightly in the way of a man who has decided something and is not looking for a discussion about it, and Rhea looked at him for a second longer than the sentence required. By 7 o'clock, the floodlights were on over the empty haul-out slip, and the rain had started properly on the tin roof of the yard office, and up the hill the string trio had begun to play. Junie waited until they were most of the way down the dock before she said anything, which for a 9-year-old is a considerable act of restraint. "You could have just said..." "Said what, kiddo?" She gave him the look that children give adults who are pretending not to follow. "You could have told him," she said, "that it is ours." Isaac tied off a line that was already tied off. The rain was coming across the basin in visible sheets, which is one of the more honest things about a working waterfront. The weather arrives from a long way off in plain sight, and there is nothing to be done about it except put boots on. "If I say that in a lobby," he said, "what happens next?" She thought about it. She was a serious child about serious questions. He gets embarrassed. He gets embarrassed in front of 90 people. And then what? Then he is nicer? Then he is careful, Isaac said, which is not the same thing. And every person in that room learns that the way you find out who somebody is around here is by finding out what they own. He straightened up. "I would rather they found out who somebody is by watching them work. That is what your grandfather did." Junie accepted this. She was 9, and her father had never lied to her, and the answer had the shape of the answers he usually gave. It was also, Amos Pell would point out about an hour later, not the whole truth. They were in the yard office. Junie was at the desk with her bird project and a cup of cocoa, and Amos had come in to sign out the borrowed jack stands and had stayed to say something he had been carrying around for 2 years. "That was a good answer you gave her on the dock," he said. "You were 50 feet away in the rain." "I have got the ears of a man who has spent 40 years listening for bad bearings." Amos sat down on the corner of the desk. "It was a good answer. It is about half true." Isaac did not say anything. "You have been the owner of this place for 5 years, Amos said, and you still eat your lunch in your truck. I am not the owner. You are the man who signs for the owner, and that is a distinction that matters to lawyers and to nobody else on this waterfront." Amos looked over at the desk, where a 9-year-old was drawing a cormorant. "I knew Hal for 30 years. He did not leave it to her so that you would have something to hide behind. That is not what I am doing." "No?" Amos stood up, which took him a moment, because he was 71 and it was raining. "Then tell me why the manager of this club has worked here 2 years and does not know your last name." He went out to move the jack stands. Isaac stood in the yard office with the rain on the tin and looked out at the lit clubhouse up the hill, and then he put his jacket back on and went out to the slings. At 9 o'clock, he started the first pull. A travel lift is a machine on rubber tires that straddles a slip, drops 2 enormous fabric slings into the water, and lifts a boat out of it. Everything about the operation depends on where those slings sit relative to the shafts, the struts, and the rudder, and getting it wrong costs somebody $20,000 and about 4 months. It is done in daylight, unhurried, with the owner standing there. They were doing it in the dark, in rain, in a rising wind, without the owners at 9 at night. And the first boat was a 42-foot sailboat with a fin keel and a spade rudder, which is the least forgiving thing to put in a sling. Amos ran the lift. Isaac was in the water in waders to the chest with a boat hook, walking the slings back by feel until they sat where they belonged, because the marks on the hull were 4 years old and the boat had been repowered since. 2 yard hands, a 19-year-old named Cy and a 22-year-old named Prosper, worked the lines. The sailboat came up out of the black water into the floodlights at 9:20, streaming, with the keel dripping and the anti-fouling paint gone soft and green. And Amos walked her back into the yard at a speed that would embarrass a person out for a stroll. Rhea came down the ramp at 9:30. She had gone up the hill one more time, gotten one more version of no, and come back down with her hood up and her jaw set. And she stood at the edge of the floodlights and watched a boat that nobody had authorized to be hauled travel across a yard. "Isaac, I know. That is 11 boats you're moving on your own say-so. 10 now? You know this is my license too," she said. "If a sling slips tonight and I stood here and watched, that is on my ticket, not just yours." "I know it is." He came up out of the water and stood in front of her, dripping, with the boat hook still in his hand. "Which is why you should go back to your office and write down that you objected. And I will sign whatever you want in the morning saying you objected. And it will be true." There was about 4 seconds of rain. "No," Rhea said. She put her tablet inside her jacket, took the second boat hook off the rack, and went down the dock to the next slip. They got 3 more up before 11. Prosper's hands were bleeding a little from a line that had run through them, and he had taped them and said nothing about it. Junie was in the yard office with the cocoa gone cold, asleep in the desk chair with her head on the bird project. Isaac carried her out to the truck and put her in the back seat with a blanket at about 11 o'clock, and stood there for a second with the door open, and then went back to work. At 11:20, up at the top of the ramp, the clubhouse door opened, and a man in a dinner jacket came out into the rain. What brought Preston Vaugh out of his own gala at 11:20 was not conscience. It was a telephone call from an insurance adjuster. Rhea, who was thorough in a way people did not notice until it mattered, had filed the emergency notification at 6. At 11, the system produced a very awake man in another state who wanted to know who was authorizing the haul-out of 11 vessels from a leased basin, because the policy covered scheduled yard operations, and this was not one. He wanted the owner's authorization in a writing. Tonight, before the surge, or the coverage would be argued about for a year. Vaugh came down the ramp with an umbrella that the wind took an immediate interest in. Rhea met him at the head of the ramp with the form already printed and in a plastic sleeve, because she had known the call was coming. "I need a signature," he said. "The insurer wants owner authorization for all of this, which I did not approve, and which is happening anyway, and I would like to be on the record about that." "Then sign the objection box," Rhea said. "It is the third one down. I will call the management company in the morning." "The management company does not own it," she said. "They run the club side under contract. The authorization has to come from the owner." "Fine. Who do I call? There must be an owner of record." Rhea looked at him for a moment with the rain coming off the edge of her hood. She had known for 2 years, because harbor masters know things, and she had never once mentioned it to anybody. "He is on your dock," she said. Vo looked down the ramp. Down there in the floodlights, 40 feet away, a man in chest waders was standing in the water beside a 36-foot powerboat with a boat hook in his hands, walking a sling aft by inches, while an old man ran the lift controls and a 19-year-old called out the distance. "The mechanic," Vo said. "The trustee," Rhea said. "The owner is 9. She is asleep in the truck." He went down the ramp. There is no dignified way to cross a boatyard in a dinner jacket in the rain, and he did not manage to find one. And the yard hands stopped what they were doing to watch him do it, which he must have felt. He stood at the edge of the slip with the form in the plastic sleeve while the powerboat came up out of the water, because there was nothing else to do until it did. When Isaac climbed out and pushed his hood back, Vo held out the sleeve. "This says," Vo said, and stopped and started again. "This says the owner of record is a minor child, held in trust." "It does." "Renfrow." He looked at the name on the form and then at the man in front of him. And the 2 seconds that followed were the longest of his professional life. "That is your name." "I am the trustee," Isaac said. "Give me the pen." That was all of it. There was no room to go quiet, because the room was a boatyard and it was raining, and the only people in it were working. Nobody stood up. Nobody applauded. A 19-year-old named Cy said, "Oh," very quietly, and was ignored. Isaac signed the form on the hood of the truck, holding his jacket over it so the ink would not run, with his daughter asleep 4 feet away on the other side of the glass. He handed the sleeve back. "There are 6 more in the water," he said, "and the tide turns in 2 hours." Then he went back to the lift. Preston Vo stood at the edge of the floodlights for about 90 seconds with a wet form in a plastic sleeve. He could have gone back up the hill. There were 140 people still in the clubhouse, a dessert course, and a band that started at 11:30, and every professional instinct he had was telling him that his job was up there. He took his dinner jacket off, folded it over the rail of the dock box, and asked what he could do. Amos, who had been waiting all night for exactly this and had prepared nothing, said, "Can you carry a stand?" He could carry a stand. A jack stand weighs about 40 pounds and has to be walked out under a hull and set on a specific spot and cranked. And the spots are not obvious to a person who has never done it, and the consequence of getting it wrong is a boat on its side. For the next 3 hours, the general manager of the club carried stands where a 22-year-old named Prosper told him to carry them. He was, by every account afterward, useless for the first hour and adequate for the last 2, which is a better trajectory than most people manage. The members came down in 1s and 2s as word went around the ballroom, which it did fast because 200 people in a coastal town cannot keep anything for long. They came down in evening clothes and stood under the eaves of the yard shed with their shoes in their hands, watching their own boats come out of the water. A woman in a green dress went up to the clubhouse and came back with 40 coffees on 2 trays, which was the single most useful thing anybody in evening clothes did that night. They got the 9th boat up at 1 o'clock. Junie woke around then and came out of the truck with the blanket around her shoulders like a small, unimpressed monarch. And Amos put her on the stool in the yard office doorway where she could see everything and be out of the rain, and checked on her every 20 minutes for the rest of the night without ever once making it obvious. Isaac caught himself watching that instead of the lift, twice. The 11th boat, a heavy old wooden 38-footer belonging to a member who had died in February and whose family had not decided anything yet, came up at 8 minutes to 2. The surge came in an hour after that. It came over the top of the floating docks in the North Basin the way water does when it has been given a following wind and a full moon tide, which is quietly and all at once. It lifted the dock system until the pilings were most of the way through their rings, and it stood there about 40 minutes. Nobody watched it happen, because everybody was in the yard with the boats. In the morning, the North Basin looked like a car park after a fair. 2 dock sections had torn free and folded back on themselves. A fuel hose was in a tree, and 11 boats stood on jack stands in the yard in the gray light, dripping, with a general manager in a ruined dress shirt, asleep, sitting up in a plastic chair beside them. Verna Adcock arrived at 11 the next morning in a car that was still unsuited to the yard. She came into the yard office, looked at the man behind the desk, who had been awake 31 hours and had a cut on the back of one hand, and set a folder down. "Well," she said, "the insurer is satisfied. The authorization was timely, and it was signed by the trustee, and I have told them so twice this morning." "Good. I am not here about the insurer." She sat down in the chair Junie usually occupied. She had been Hal Coyle's attorney for 19 years before she was Junie's, and she got to things without any run-up. "5 years," she said. "You have been a trustee for 5 years, and last night the general manager of the club learned your name off an insurance form at 11 o'clock at night in the rain. It worked out. It worked out because you are good at your job, and the wind held off for 2 hours. Verna folded her hands. "Isaac, I am going to say the unpleasant version, and then I am going to have a coffee, and we will talk about the docks." He waited. "You have told yourself that keeping quiet protects her," she said. "It does not. It defers her. Every year you say nothing. That place accumulates people who have no idea who they are working for, and no reason to have thought about it. And one day, a girl of 25 is going to walk into a room full of them and have to explain herself from a standing start. That is 15 years away. It is 15 years of habit away, which is worse." Verna let that sit. "She is going to ask you why nobody knew. I would like you to have a better answer than modesty, because modesty is a very comfortable place to keep a thing you do not want to carry." Isaac looked out of the window at the yard, where 11 boats stood on stands and a man in a borrowed work shirt was walking the rows with Amos, being shown what a soft spot in a hull looks like. "Hal did not want a plaque," he said. "Hal put his name on the sign at the head of the ramp in 1978 and left it there for 43 years, Verna said. "Do not use him as cover. He would be the first to tell you so, and he would use worse language than I do." She had her coffee. They talked about the docks, which needed a great deal of money and a marine contractor and a permit that would take until September. That afternoon, Isaac walked out to the end of D-Dock with his daughter and told her properly at her altitude what the trust was. Not the version from the rain. The whole shape of it. What her grandfather had done. What a trustee is. What happens when she is 25 and what happens before then, which is that she comes to the meetings if she wants and is told the truth when she asks. She took it the way children take large things, which is one piece at a time. "Do I have to run it?" she asked. "No." "Do I have to be good at boats?" "No, although you already are, so that ship has sailed." She looked at the North Basin, where two dock sections were folded over on themselves like a bad hand of cards. "Do I have to fix that?" "No, kiddo," Isaac said. "You have to know it is yours. Everything else is a choice you get to make later, and I will be standing right here for all of them." A week later, Isaac went up to the clubhouse office, through the front door in work clothes, and nobody stopped him, which he noticed and decided not to make anything of. Preston Vaux stood up when he came in, which was new. "I have been waiting for this," Vaux said. "I want to say that I have written a resignation, and it is in the drawer, and I would rather you have it than the management company." "Leave it in the drawer." Isaac sat down. He had thought about this conversation for 6 days, mostly at 2 in the morning, and he had arrived at something he was not entirely comfortable with, which he had decided was probably the sign of it being right. "Here is what I want," he said. "You keep the job through the season. 2 conditions, and they are not negotiable, and I am not going to enjoy enforcing either of them." "All right. You work 2 shifts a month in the yard, not a tour. Shifts. Prosper writes the schedule, and you are on it like anybody else. And when he tells you to carry a stand, you carry it." Vaux nodded slowly. "And the second one?" "The words 'the help' do not exist here anymore," Isaac said. "Not for the yard, not for the kitchen, not for the kid who does the fuel dock in August. If I hear it, we are having a different conversation, and it will be short." "And if I say no?" "Then you say no," Isaac said. "I am not going to enjoy either answer. I would rather have a manager who learns something in May than spend a summer training a new one." Vaux was quiet for a moment. "May I ask a question that is not my business?" "You may ask." "Why did you not say something?" "That night, in the lobby." He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "You could have ended it in 4 words." "I could have," Isaac said. "My daughter asked me the same thing on the dock about 10 minutes later, and I gave her a fairly noble answer, and a man who has known me for 40 years told me an hour after that it was about half true." He stood up. "Turns out, it is easier to be underestimated than to be in charge. I have been taking the easy one for 5 years. That is the honest version." Word went around the members the way it does on a waterfront, which is sideways, over about 3 weeks, mostly at the fuel dock. There was no announcement. There was no letter. There was an old member named Doris telling a new member named Kip, while he pumped 40 gallons of diesel, that the mechanic who had just walked past was the fellow who owned the place, or near enough, and that his little girl was the one it was actually left to, and that Hal Coyle had done that on purpose, and that if Kip wanted the real story, he should ask Amos and set aside an afternoon. Kip said he did not believe it. Doris said that was fine, and that the same thing had happened to her in 1994 with a different owner. On a Thursday at the end of June, Rhea Amato came down the floating dock with 2 coffees, which was a reversal noticed by both of them. They talked for 40 minutes about a fuel pump at the end of a dock that had been failing intermittently since April. Neither of them mentioned that the conversation had gone on considerably longer than the fuel pump required, and neither of them left. And when Amos went past on the yard cart, he had the sense to look straight ahead. The sign went up at the head of the ramp in the second week of July. It was not a large sign, and it was not a bronze one. It was marine plywood, hand-painted by a retired sign writer up the coast who still did lettering by eye, and it cost about $200. And it said, Junie Coyle, Renfrow, Marina. Established 1978, the girl it was named for had been consulted, at length, and had held out for a cormorant in the corner. She got the cormorant. It has the correct number of toes because her father checked. This is the Tuesday morning in July the story began on. The gulls came down the dock twice before 6. Amos greased the travel lift and dropped a rag, and a herring gull carried it about 30 feet and dropped it in the water, which is a thing that had been happening between the two of them for 4 years. 11 boats were back in the water. The North Basin had a temporary dock system in it and a permit application working through the state, and the marine contractor had said September and meant November. Preston Bowe was in the yard at 7 in a work shirt on the second of his 2 shifts that month, moving stands with Prosper, who had stopped explaining things to him and now simply pointed, which is a promotion of a kind. Rhea walked the floating dock with her clipboard and a pencil behind her ear. Counting cleats she had already counted, which is a thing harbor masters do when they want an excuse to be somewhere. And Isaac Renfrow was on his knees on a swim platform with his head in the Whitaker boat's bilge, because it was still filling with water, and nobody had worked out why yet. Junie sat on the dock box in the sun, arguing with Amos about whether gulls can count. Amos held that they cannot. Junie held that the one that took the rag had waited until he put it down, which she considered decisive. The Marina had belonged to a 9-year-old for 5 years, and to her mother's family for 48 before that, and the man who kept it running had never once needed his name on the sign in order to do the work. What the spring had changed was not that. It had only changed who knew. Somewhere behind them the travel lift started up, and none of the 4 of them turned around to look at the sign, because it had already stopped being news. And neither the man in the bilge nor the woman with the clipboard had been looking for anything that season. They had only been looking out for the same stretch of water from opposite ends of the same dock for 6 years.